So the third talk is going to be given by, I believe it's going to have a topic on boss fault attack.
Yeah.
And please help just introduce yourself.
So I'm Nimish Mishra.
So you are the first author, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Nimish is going to give the talk. Okay.
How does this work? Right. So, hi everyone. I'm Nimish, and I'll be presenting our work on fault attacks and their implications on ARM TrustZone, or more largely to embedded systems. So this work was done at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, and the structure of this talk is something like this. So first, we'll talk a little bit about how traditional fault attacks on SoCs work, or what architectural aspects of SoCs are usually targeted for fault attacks. Then we'll be introducing an alternative architectural aspect that we systemize and evaluate in this work. And then we show how we use that to break open portable trusted execution environment. That would be one of the implementations on ARM TrustZone for the embedded systems market. So traditional aspects of, or traditional architectural aspects for fault injections on SoCs. So traditionally, fault injections have been focused on either the processor or the memory. So for the general audience, in fault injection, you'll like to attach some external device onto your embedded systems and make some changes around the device such that the internal execution of the device is faulted. And then you use that faulted execution to somehow achieve your objectives. So these external manipulations could be changing the magnetic field around the embedded system or shining optical lasers upon it. So they have different flavors, but the idea is the adversary can influence the physical environment of the system and force computations to go wrong, and then use them to for some objectives. So traditionally, for processors, one could attach an external interface like a voltage or a clock glitch device. So when some important cryptographic operation, for instance, is going on, you glitch the clock or maybe drop the voltage for a very small period of time, and that causes problems, and then you exploit them. Or you could use the on-device DVFS, dynamic voltage frequency scaling. So software solutions to drop the voltage and cause problems again in the process while something important is being processed, and then you exploit that. On the other hand, you could have faults in memory. So row hammer is one. You exploit the discharges in capacitors from which memory is usually structured, and use them for exploitation. Or you could have a separate physical device like an optical laser station or an electromagnetic attack to this extent. Now, in context of SoCs, these usually do not work anymore. So for instance, if I take the example of Raspberry Pi systems or systems on the systems like of similar high frequency SoC market, you do not usually have an external interface that you can attach to those systems and do glitching. And the DVFS or the dynamic voltage frequency scaling interfaces are also privileged. So in some sense, you do not have access to the traditional fault attack setups on the processor. And on the memory side, if you try to do row hammer, you'll be caught. There are error correcting code checks, which will immediately detect whenever some faults have been introduced in the memory. And then you have external casings that you can put on your embedded systems and prevent external attacks. So a natural question at this point is if there are other architectural aspects which we can use for similar objectives for which some of the defenses that I just talked about do not apply. So system bus. So system bus, the connection between the processor and the memory and everything that goes on. So that's the focus in this work. So we found that the system bus is uncased and exposed. So here's a snap of the Raspberry Pi 3 on the backside. And the exposed system bus between the memory chip and the processor is exposed to the adversary in some sense. The system bus would be involved definitely with load and stores, or in some sense, memory operations. And I must mention that prior works have looked at fault attacks on system buses in some sense, but mostly they were simulations. And one attack, which was by GeoHot around 10 to 12 years back on PlayStation 3, was where they attached an external device to the system bus of the PlayStation 3 system and skipped memory cycles. There was a lawsuit from Sony, and there was a lot of noise about that as well. In this work, however, we would like to achieve different objectives that would become clear in a while. But overall, this is a third architectural aspect which we believe has not been evaluated to that extent when we talk about fault attacks. So here's the attack principle. So on the right, you can see that we have an electromagnetic fault attack probe mounted on a stand and positioned around the or positioned at a point where the system bus between the processor and the memory would be exposed to the attacker on the printed circuit board. So the way this works is you can manipulate the current that goes in this loop, and that causes changes in the magnetic field perpendicular to it. And the question is that if you can exploit it in some sense. So in this talk, we'll be looking at one instruction, a load instruction. So the load instruction will technically contain two operands, a destination register to which you want to store some memory, and definitely the memory address from which you want to fetch. So the execution of this instruction proceeds as follows. You put the memory address onto the bus. The bus communicates the same to the memory module. Assume at this point the memory address has some data, so that data is given back to the processor. Now the attack principle is that while this exchange is happening, if you can inject a fault in the operation of the bus, then the faulted data is loaded onto the destination register. So in some sense, that this is the foundation of what we are trying to do here. So as a proof of concept, we enabled a differential fault attack on a T-table implementation of AES on a high-frequency SoC. The reason this seems novel enough is because when we talk about high-frequency SoCs with the defenses I mentioned a while back, redoing a DFA on AES is not straightforward. So we re-enabled a very old attack 10 to 12 years back, again on high-frequency SoCs that exist now. And we use a companion work. It's cited here by Tunstall and Devdeep Mukhopadhyay, who is also one of the authors of this work, to reduce the key entropy to the power 8. So at this point, by combining our fault injection attack vector with the fault analysis from this companion work, you can basically reduce the AES key entropy to the power 8 and then just brute force it. So if I just very quickly compare on how this fault attack on a system bus compares with memory. So when we do comparisons, we say the probe position is something, the probe position is at a place that it does not influence the memory directly. And we also observe that if you reload data from the memory after removing the probe, then the data is fetched correctly. So it's a transient fault in some sense. So the memory is still intact. So if you have error correcting codes in place, they'll not catch this injection. And a similar argument for comparison with processor. We observe that if we try to attack the processor directly, because of the casings in place and other things, the attack does not work. And again, the probe position was not on the processor. It was somewhere between the processor and the memory. So a very quick characterization and success rate of this attack. So if you end up faulting the data that is loaded into the destination register, so we call it data faults, which in some sense result in incorrect data to the destination register. Out of 10,000 executions, we found that 38% of the times you'll observe no fault. So that's something which is very usual with fault attack setups. Simply you injected a fault, but it did not influence the system in the way you wanted to. 35% of the times you were able to fault it to 0. So basically, it doesn't matter what data was being loaded, the final register contained a 0, and other cases 27%. And another thing that can happen is the memory address from which you are fetching can also get faulted. In that case, usually that might result in a segmentation fault. So 31% of the times we observed a seg fault, and 69% times no fault or something else. So I like to point out this particular scenario because this will be important later. So doesn't matter what was the data in memory, the register contains a 0. We call it a register sweeping attack in this sense that it cleans the value of a load instruction. And we use this to mount an end-to-end attack on MyTEE, which I'll describe now. So very quickly, a primer on the architecture of the TE under question. So there's a bit to unpack here, but the execution starts on the upper right side, which is the user space exception level 0. So some client application wants some help from the secure world to do some crypto, for instance, in this case. So through a series of system calls, it will trickle down to the secure monitor call handler at the exception layer 2, which is the most privileged one. The monitor will switch context to the left in this case, and will, through again a series of system calls, go to the TE side exception level 1, and finally at the very top on the left, where we have a TA, or a trusted application. Now this trusted application will do whatever it's supposed to do, maybe a cryptography or something similar. And once it is done, it just follows the same path in reverse and sends back the information back to the client application on the right side. In our case, the attack point is this particular position where the trusted application is being loaded into the secure world. So abstractly, that translates to the listing that we have on the left. So an abstract function load TA first checks whether the TA signature matches that with the original equipment manufacturers. Or in some sense, it checks whether the TA has indeed been written by the original equipment manufacturer, and if so, it returns a success, otherwise a failure. And if it's a failure, then execution is aborted immediately. So in some sense, you cannot load your own TA into the system. And if you try some of the methods that we just discussed to basically bypass this, so external glitches are not available, DBFS is privileged, protected TA memory ensures row hammer cannot be done. And the most interesting part is the signing key for the TAs cannot be stolen because the signing key is not on the device. So the signature verification is asymmetric, which means the manufacturer signs the modules, puts them on the device, and attaches them with the verification key. The signing key is not on the device. So it's impossible to steal them. So the question becomes, how do you load your own TA into the secure world? So if you look at the success rate, if you look at the error codes here, the intuition is if we can use the register sweeping fault attack I just described a while back to achieve this. So the intuition would be load your own TA. Definitely that will fail signature verification, and a non-zero exit code will be returned. Then inject a fault and make it 0. So in some sense, you are basically bypassing signature verification through the fault attack I just mentioned. And we do this by developing a combined adversary. So on the left, we attach an external device to the embedded system, and collect part traces. This allows us to understand when exactly in the execution the signature verification is happening, and then we can use this to inform fault injection, which is on the right. So there are 3 signals here that I'll just very quickly go over. The green signal is basically the signals from the device when some move instruction is happening and when the verification is happening. And at the very bottom, you have the magenta signal. It's very thin because in some sense, we are just giving very small period of time to the fault injection. But if I zoom in into the magenta signal, you'll see many square pulses, which are, the width of those pulses are in the order of nanoseconds. So that magenta signal is in some sense the actual signals that we are sending out to the probe. And the delay between the magenta signal and the big square pulse on the green signal side is the delay of the hardware. So we want to tweak that such that the magenta signal arrives on the embedded system just when the verification is happening. And using this, we were able to load our own self-signed adversarial controlled TA into the trusted execution environment we were working with. And the next question then becomes is, how can we increase the capability of this TA? So definitely we want to steal communication for other TAs in the system and then decrypt it as well. So basically a complete breakdown of security on the trust zone. So if I just abstract out on how things happen when a trusted execution happens, the insecure world gives some calls to the secure world. The secure world looks up a identifier table, a unique identifier table, to understand which trusted application must execute, and then the execution happens. So we found out that the GlobalPlatform API specification relies on the equipment manufacturer to make sure that no 2 trusted applications share the identifier. Now this makes sense because so far the assumption is that the equipment manufacturer loads the trusted application onto the system. However, because of our fault attacks, the adversary is now able to load their own trusted application, in some sense a self-signed trusted application, into the secure world. And what we found out was no one stops an adversary from choosing the same identifier as some other benign trusted application in the system. And if this happens, there's something that we call a UUID confusion, or a unique identifier confusion, which in some sense means that if 2 trusted applications have the same identifier, then a non-persistent application is preferred over a persistent one, where persistence is defined in the same sense that we do with servers in a networks setting. So the way to do this is, if you want to redirect communication for some other TA to your own, load your self-signed TA with the same identifier as the other one, and then collide the persistence of the 2. So a persistent benign TA, so make your TA non-persistent, and then the communication simply redirects. I must mention at this point, this communication is still encrypted with the keys of the actual benign TA, so we still have work to do there. Now, the way this encryption is handled, using third-party extensions, of course, is that whenever you need to sign or encrypt something, a key transfer happens, and you do all the work, and then you surrender the key to this extension. The extension itself relies upon certain protections, like it disallows SIG traps. SIG traps would be the signals for debuggers. It blocks unauthorized reads to sensitive data pages. So in some sense, you cannot directly read out the key. However, what we found out was that such extensions do not protect against segmentation faults, because assumptions, they are relying upon the client applications and the trusted applications to make sure that they themselves do not do segmentation faults. And that's something which is more or less a decent assumption, given that the equipment manufacturer is uploading those codes. Now, what we found out was that if you inject a segmentation fault using our fault attack, in that case, you can simply leak the key. And you can do it using the address bus faults that I mentioned a while back. So here's a very quick summary of the entire attack. Let's say if you want to attack, example, machine learning as a service TA. The first step on the very left, inject a bus fault to upload a cell sign TA into the system. Then in the middle, use the UUID confusion exploit that we just discussed to reroute communication to the green TA. So instead of the green TA, reroute communication to the red one. And third step, use an address bus fault or a segmentation fault to leak the keys, as I mentioned. This allows you the capability of those 4 things at the very right. So you can decrypt any communication of any TA in the system, change whatever you want with that, re-encrypt, re-sign, and send it anywhere. And basically, you masquerade at the TA. So that was more or less this work. And I must end. Yeah. So we talked about this with Lenaro, which was the company who handles this entire TA for ARM TrustZone. And we got a CV. We also worked together with them to deploy a countermeasure for this in the Opti kernel. And this is the lab setup that we have at Kharagpur, which enabled us to do this work. So side channel evaluations, fault attacks, microarchitectural evaluations, that's something that we do. And I conclude by mentioning that the combined adversary here, which is a combination of side channels plus faults, so we will be talking about that at Black Hat Asia next month. So if you're stopping by at Singapore, so we can discuss this there as well. So thank you. And if there are any questions, so I'll happy to answer. Thanks.
All right.